Was sitting at my kitchen table, going over some old lesson plans I promised to help a neighbor's kid with, when I heard the knock at the door. Not a ring. A knock. 3 sharp raps, the kind that said whoever was on the other side wasn't asking permission. I remember looking up at the clock. It was just past 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. My grandson, Theo, was in his room, probably doing what he always did at that hour. Headphones on, fingers moving across his keyboard like he was having a conversation with the machine that no one else could hear. I set my pen down and went to the door. She was standing on my porch in a blazer I didn't recognize, next to a man in a suit who had a briefcase and the kind of careful expression that people learn in law school. My daughter, Renee. 41 years old. Hair done up. Earrings. I'd never seen before. I hadn't seen her in 4 years. The man beside her introduced himself as her attorney. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at me. And neither of us spoke first. Then I heard Theo's chair roll back from his desk down the hall, and his voice came through the door, calm and even. "Let them in, Grandpa. I know why she's here. I need to go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it." Renee was 27 when Theo was born. She was living in Phoenix at the time with a man named Kyle. I never liked Kyle, but that's not the point. And when the baby came, things seemed fine for about 8 months. Then they didn't. Kyle left first. Then Renee started calling me every few weeks with a different crisis. "The baby won't sleep. The baby screams all day. I can't do this, Dad. I can't do this." I drove out to Phoenix twice that year. Both times I found Theo in a crib that needed changing, and Renee on the couch, looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. I'm not telling this to condemn her. I'm telling it because it's what happened. The 3rd time she called, she said the words I hadn't expected. "I need you to take him. Just for a while. I need to get myself together." My wife Susan had passed 2 years before. It was just me in the house in Flagstaff, retired from 31 years of teaching, 4th grade, living on a pension and Social Security, with more quiet than I knew what to do with. My daughter was asking me to take her 18-month-old son, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. I thought just for a while meant a few months, maybe a year. Theo came to live with me in March. By the following March, Renee had moved to Seattle. I got a card at Christmas. Then the card stopped. I want to tell you about the boy Theo was, because that matters more than anything else in this story. He was 2 years old when a pediatric specialist in Flagstaff told me he was on the autism spectrum. High functioning, they said, which I later learned was a term that explained some things and obscured others. He had routines that couldn't be disrupted without causing real distress. He lined up his toy cars by color, then by size, then by some other system I couldn't figure out, but that clearly made sense to him. He didn't like loud noises. He didn't like being touched by strangers. He communicated in his own way and on his own timeline, and if you were patient enough to wait for it, what he said was almost always worth hearing. His first sentence, his actual first full sentence at age 3, was "The clouds are moving the wrong direction." I didn't know what to say to that. I looked up at the sky and said, "You might be right, buddy." He nodded like that settled it, and went back inside. The school district was another story. There were meetings and evaluations and IEP documents that I read 5 times each, and teachers who meant well but didn't know what to do with a kid who could calculate the angles of shadows at noon, but couldn't sit through a 30-minute assembly. I pushed back when I needed to, and I advocated loud when no one was listening. I drove him 40 minutes each way to a specialist in Sedona every other Thursday for 2 years. I learned things at 63 years old that I never learned in 3 decades of teaching, because my grandson needed me to learn them. I also filed for legal guardianship through the Coconino County courts when Theo was 3.5. A neighbor who worked in family law helped me understand that I needed it. It wasn't fast and it wasn't cheap, but it was necessary. And when the paperwork came through, I framed the first page and put it in my desk drawer where I could find it when I needed to remember why I did any of this. I never heard from Renee during that process. The court made attempts to contact her. She didn't respond. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was what was happening inside Theo's head during all of this. He taught himself to read at 4. Not because I sat him down with flashcards, but because he wanted to read the error messages on my old laptop. I found him one morning pressing keys and then looking at the screen and pressing different keys, and he'd somehow figured out that certain letters made certain things happen. By 7, he was writing simple programs. I didn't know what I was looking at, honestly. I knew enough to buy him books, used ones from the library sale, then new ones when I saw he'd read all the used ones, and to get him a decent laptop when mine finally gave out. My brother Frank sent $300 at Christmas one year and said to put it towards something Theo needed. I bought the laptop with that money and $50 of my own. By 11, Theo was building things I genuinely could not evaluate. I could see they were complex. I could see he cared about them. I would sit next to him sometimes and ask him to explain what he was doing, and he would, very patiently in terms he thought I might understand, and I would nod and try to follow along and mostly just be glad he wanted to explain it to me at all. He struggled in school, not with the material, he was usually years ahead, but with everything around the material. The noise, the schedule changes, the social dynamics that moved too fast and too randomly for him to track. We found a small charter school in town that had smaller classes and a teacher, Ms. Darlene Krause, who had been doing this for 20 years and had a gift for it. She told me at the end of Theo's first week there, "This kid sees the world differently. Our job is to make sure the world doesn't crush that out of him." I drove him there every morning for 4 years. He turned 14 the summer he started his first real project. He'd been bothered. And bothered is the right word. It was a physical discomfort for him. By the way, his scheduling apps never sync correctly. He tried 4 different ones and they all had the same problem, which was that they treated tasks as separate items instead of as parts of a connected system. He explained this to me one evening over dinner, plates of spaghetti in front of us, and I remember thinking that I didn't fully understand what he was describing, but that he clearly understood it completely. "Have you looked into whether someone's already solved that?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "They haven't done it right." He started working on it that fall. He worked on it through the following winter, through the spring, through another summer. I made sure he ate and slept and got outside sometimes. I drove him to a coding boot camp in Tucson 2 summers in a row, both times with money I'd carefully set aside for my pension. He didn't talk about what he was building in terms of money or success. He talked about it in terms of whether it was right, whether the architecture was correct, whether it did what it was supposed to do in the way it was supposed to do it. He was 16 when he launched a beta version. Within 3 months, 22,000 people had downloaded it. He didn't tell me until the number was higher than that. "Why didn't you say something?" I asked. He thought about it. "I wasn't sure it would hold." It held. By the time Theo turned 17, a technology firm in Austin had made a licensing offer. The number they put on the table was $4.3 million, with a development partnership on top of that. Theo showed me the email sitting at his desk, and I stood behind him and read it twice, and then I had to go sit down at the kitchen table by myself for a few minutes. When I came back, he looked at me and said, "I want to use some of it for you." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I know," he said. "That's not why. I should tell you that in the years between Renee leaving and Theo's deal, I heard from her maybe a dozen times. A few phone calls around the holidays, scattered and brief. One visit when Theo was 7. She drove down from Seattle, stayed 2 nights, took Theo to the park, left on a Sunday morning with a hug and a promise to come back soon. She didn't come back soon. She didn't come back soon. Theo didn't ask about her much. When he did, I answered honestly and without anger, which was sometimes hard. "Why doesn't she live with us?" he asked once, around age 9. "She's working through some things," I said. "It's not because of you." He was quiet for a moment. "I know it's not because of you," he said one odd. "I was asking about her." That was Theo, always asking the question underneath the question. The knock at the door came 6 weeks after the licensing deal was finalized. I stood in the doorway and looked at my daughter and the man in the suit, and I felt something move through me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was more like recognition, like a part of me had always known this moment was coming, had been waiting for it in the back of some quiet room in my mind for years. The attorney's name was Paulson. He was from a firm in Scottsdale. He spoke in the careful, modulated tone of someone who charges by the hour and has learned not to waste words. Renee stood slightly behind him and to the left. She didn't quite meet my eyes at first. I brought them inside because Theo had said to. We sat in the living room, the attorney and Renee on the couch, me in the chair I always sat in, Theo in the doorway of the hall, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. He was wearing the gray hoodie he wore most days. His expression was the one he got when he was concentrating, still and very clear. Paulson opened his briefcase and placed a document on the coffee table. Mr. Harwood, he said to me, my client is Theo's biological mother and has parental standing too. I have legal guardianship, I said, filed in 2012, granted in 2013. Paulson paused. He hadn't expected that to be the first thing out of my mouth. Renee glanced at him. That's actually one of the things we'd like to discuss, Paulson said, recovering smoothly. The terms of the guardianship, and whether, given Theo's age and changed circumstances, a review might be. I'm 17, Theo said from the doorway. Paulson turned to look at him. Yes. In Arizona, I can petition for my own emancipation at 16. I didn't because I didn't need to, but I could. He paused. I've already spoken with an attorney. That was the moment the air in the room changed. Renee finally looked at me directly. There was something in her face I hadn't expected. Not hardness, but something more like embarrassment trying to hold itself together. I felt the familiar, complicated knot of feeling that I always felt when I looked at her. She was my daughter. I had loved her when she was small, had driven her to school and sat through her recitals and helped her with her college applications. None of that went away. But love doesn't erase what happened, and what happened was 11 years of Theo's life that she wasn't there for. I let Paulson finish what he'd come to say. It took about 20 minutes. The gist of it was that Renee wanted to establish a formal relationship with Theo going forward, and that as his biological parent, she had certain rights she wished to exercise, and that the licensing deal created circumstances that warranted review of the existing guardianship arrangement. I didn't interrupt. I had learned a long time ago, in 31 years of handling parents at school, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone say everything they came to say, and then sit quietly for a moment before you respond. When Paulson finished, the room was silent. Theo pushed off from the doorframe and walked into the living room. He sat down in the chair across from the couch, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at his mother directly. Not with anger, with a particular focused calm that had always been uniquely his. I want to say something, he said to her. Not to your attorney, to you. Renee said, Okay, you left when I was 18 months old. I know that. I've thought about it a lot, and I don't want to be angry about it for the rest of my life, because that would be a waste of time and energy, and I've read enough about what happens to people who carry that kind of thing to know I don't want it. He paused. He was very still, but I also want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now. You didn't raise me. Grandpa raised me. He drove me to school every morning and went to every IEP meeting and learned things about autism that he had to learn from scratch when he was 63 years old. He spent money he didn't have on specialists and laptops and coding camps because I needed them. He did that without asking for anything back. He looked at her steadily. The app is mine. The deal is mine. Grandpa has already been taken care of, because that was the first thing I did after the contracts were signed. What you're sitting across from right now is not a resource. It's a person who remembers what it felt like when you didn't come back, and who is choosing right now not to be defined by that. Renee's eyes were wet. I wasn't going to look away from her to hide that I noticed. Theo continued, If you want a relationship with me, I'm open to that. Carefully, slowly, on terms we both agree to. But that's a completely separate conversation from whatever your attorney has in that briefcase, and those two things are not going to happen at the same time. He sat back. So you can choose, he said simply. Which conversation do you want to have? Paulson left with his briefcase and his documents about 20 minutes later. Renee stayed. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, and I made coffee, and Theo got a glass of water, and for a long time nobody said much of anything. That was all right. I've lived long enough to know that some silences are productive ones. Renee cried a little, quietly, the way people do when they're not trying to make a point with it but can't stop themselves. She said she was sorry. She said it more than once, and the second time she said it, she was looking at Theo, and Theo looked back at her and didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't okay, exactly, and he was never going to say something he didn't mean. But he nodded. That was what he gave her, and it was honest, and I think on some level she understood what it cost him. We didn't resolve everything that day. That's not how these things work, and anyone who tells you a single conversation can fix 11 years of absence is selling you something. But Renee came back the following month, and the month after that. Not pushing, not demanding, just showing up, carefully, on the terms Theo had laid out in that living room. He let her in slowly. That was his choice to make, and he made it with the same precision and deliberateness he brought to everything. I watched them sit at this table and talk, haltingly at first, and then a little less so, and I thought about Susan, who had wanted grandchildren so badly and had only just met Theo before she was gone. I thought about 31 years of teaching other people's children, all those afternoons grading papers at the kitchen table, never imagining that the most important student I'd ever have would be the one who came to live in my spare room and showed me what patience was really for. The deal closed in the fold. Theo turned 18 the following spring. He deferred his enrollment at Arizona State to spend a year building the next version of the product. I still have the guardianship paperwork in my desk drawer. I've thought about whether to take it out and put something else there, now that he's legally an adult and doesn't need it anymore. I think I'll leave it where it is. Not because he needs it, but because I do. To remind me that there was a moment when a court asked whether this child had someone willing to stand for him, and the answer was yes. Just yes. Without conditions or calculations, without knowing what any of it would one day become. On the morning of his 18th birthday, Theo came downstairs and found me at the kitchen table with my coffee, same as always. He sat across from me and ate his toast the way he always did, crusts off, cut on the diagonal, placed at the edge of the plate. Some things don't change. After a while, he said, "I've been thinking about what I want to say." I waited. "Thank you," he said, "for believing I was worth the investment before there was any evidence I would be." I looked at this young man across from me, this person I had watched become himself, one slow morning at a time, and I thought about how many ways there are to love someone and how few of them look like what you expect. "Theo," I said, "you were never an investment. You were just mine to take care of." He nodded once, the way he did when something was settled. Then he picked up the other half of his toast and we finished breakfast. Outside, the Flagstaff sky was doing what it always does in early April. Clouds moving fast from the northwest. Shadows running across the red rock like something alive. Theo noticed it before I did. He always noticed things like that first. "Weather's changing," he said. "Looks like it," I said. He tilted his head, watching the sky. "I think it'll be okay, though." I looked at him, and then I looked at the clouds, and then I looked back at my grandson. "Yeah," I said. "I think you're right." I've had a lot of time to think about how all of this unfolded. Not just the last few years, all of it. The long stretch of it. The Tuesday mornings driving Theo to school in the dark. The IEP meetings where I had to learn a whole new language just to advocate for one small boy who saw the world differently than the rest of us. The nights I sat at this kitchen table after he'd gone to bed and wondered whether I was doing any of it right. What I keep coming back to is this. The way things turned out wasn't luck. It wasn't some invisible force arranging events in our favor. It was the accumulated weight of choices, made one at a time over years. Small choices mostly. Show up. Pay attention. Don't quit when it gets hard. Learn what you don't know. Do it again tomorrow. Theo didn't become who he is because the world was kind to him. The world wasn't particularly kind to him. Schools didn't know what to do with him. His own mother left. There were specialists who wrote him off in the language of reports and evaluations reducing a whole human being to a set of deficits on a page. What Theo had, instead of the world's kindness, was something more reliable, a mind that never stopped working and the stubbornness to keep building something until it was right. That came from inside him. I didn't give him that. I just made sure nobody took it away. And that's the thing about raising a child that I don't think gets said plainly enough. The job isn't to hand them a finished life. The job is to protect the space where they can become themselves. To be the person who shows up at the meeting, who drives the 40 minutes, who reads the report twice and pushes back when something isn't right. Not because you're guaranteed a return on it, but because the child in front of you deserves someone who acts like they matter, and if you do that long enough and consistently enough, they start to believe it themselves. That belief is where everything else begins. Renee made different choices. I'm not going to spend what's left of my life being angry about that, because anger is expensive and I've already spent enough on things that didn't give me much back. What I will say is that her choices had consequences, and those consequences were real and specific, and they lasted 11 years. You cannot abandon someone and then return when the circumstances improve and expect the account to be balanced. That's not how it works. Not because the universe is punishing you, just because trust is built slowly and broken quickly, and rebuilding it requires the same kind of patience and consistency that building it required the first time. Theo understood that instinctively. He didn't close the door on his mother, but he didn't pretend the door had always been open. He held both things at once, the willingness to try and the clear-eyed understanding of what had happened, and he did it without bitterness and without naivety. That's a kind of emotional intelligence that most adults I know are still working toward. I think about what I want to leave him with when it's all said and done. Not money, though I'm glad he'll be all right. Not advice. He's already smarter than me in most of the ways that matter. What I want him to carry forward is just the knowledge that he was worth showing up for, every single day, without conditions. That's all I ever tried to give him. Some days I think it was enough.